Where does the Antichrist come from?
From the devil.
You are correct. Revelation chapter 13 says that he receives his power and his seat.
Yes.
S-E-A-T. Actually, the Greek word is thronos. His throne from the dragon. And who's the dragon over in the book of Revelation? Yes, of course. But that's going to be behind the scenes, much like in Ezekiel 28, where it talks about the king of Tyre as a expression of Satan in Ezekiel 28. I'm thinking about Ezekiel 38 because we may get that way later tonight. But Ezekiel 28, it makes a distinction between the natural human prince of Tyre, the ruler of Tyre, and then there is the king of Tyre, which is really the power behind the throne. And we have been showing how that there is going to be an arch-demon that is going from the bottomless pit who will be released during the fifth trumpet in the book of Revelation. I think that's the 9th chapter of the book. That will come out of the bottomless pit to possess the human being who is going to become Antichrist and will go on into perdition as they go through the last 3.5 years of Gentile times. But as I passed out this chart last week, and here, you didn't get this one. Got it on the late side. This is for tonight. And in these 3 pages, I am presenting basically a summary of what we've covered up, really including last week, where we finally got to the third piece of the puzzle. In Daniel 7, chapter 7, verse 8, he is pictured as having his roots within the territory of the ancient Roman Empire, whereas in chapter 8, verse 9, he's pictured as having his roots within the territory of the ancient Grecian Empire. But we're not told. We're told one of those 4 hordes, one of those 4 divisions. You have Cassander, Lysimachus, Ptolemy, and Seleucus. Those 4 divisions of the Grecian Empire after the death of Alexander the Great around, 301 BC. Before that time, there was as many as a dozen different generals that was jockeying for position. But the Bible seems to focus upon those 4. And we're told he's going to come up out of one of those 4 divisions, but it's not until we get down to verse 36 of the 11th chapter, and we've gone through all of this. And so I don't feel like I'm obligated to go back and piece it all together. Basically, I've given you a summary. If you've missed some of those lessons, given you a summary here leading up to this last part. I had emphasized last week, look at the bottom of page 2, that chapter 11, verse 35 is I call it a bridge. I've never heard anybody else refer to it in that manner, but I think that's a legitimate expression of what we see happening in that verse of Scripture. Up until that point, from down around verse 21 to verse 34 in Daniel chapter 11, we are dealing with a powerful ancient ruler of the Seleucid Empire, one of the kings of the north, known in history as Antiochus Epiphanes. And it's during his reign that you have the time of the Maccabees, the Maccabean revolt against him when he tried to institute in the temple at Jerusalem the worship of Zeus with offering swine's flesh on the altar and verses 32 to 34. Remember last week I pinpointed, although they're not mentioned by name in prophecy, I believe it is a fair representation of what was to be fulfilled here in those three verses, verses 32 to 34. That happened at that time when the temple was cleansed, and we celebrate it even today by what we call, our modern Jews anyhow do, the Feast of Hanukkah. Actually, in the New Testament, Jesus celebrated it under the term the Feast of Dedication. And so it was represented in the Bible, but not as an Old Testament feast. And then in verse 35, as I said, up to and including verse 34, we're dealing with the older king of the north. And then when we come to verse 35, we read this, and it says, and some of them, that's going to be referring to those during the time of the Maccabees, right down to the time of the end, some of them of understanding shall fall, to try them, to purge, and to make them white. Get this, even to the time of the end. This is where we cross the bridge. There is a time gap here that, I don't know if you still have the chart that I'd given you on the 5 major visions of Daniel, and each one of them has built in a time gap in that event. Now, some of you weren't here to get that. I don't know if I can find that real quickly. Okay, here it is. Who didn't get this chart? I can give you a copy of it now, but did you get anything that looked like this?
No.
I know I passed it up, but you may not have been here at the time. Did you get anything like that?
Yeah.
You got that one. I'm sure you did.
Well, you've been here.
You don't remember this one? Did you miss that week? He's got it. He's got it. You just don't remember. We've been working on this for 2 months, so I forgive you if you don't remember everything I passed on. You got it. Yes. All right. I merely was making brief reference to this. As you can see, under chapter 11, I had designed this chart back in 1974, so I didn't get started on the study of Daniel just when I was asked this question 2 months ago. But I wanted you to see that in each of these 5 major visions, I put the 9th chapter at the end because it doesn't fit into a harmony of like the others do in covering some of the same territory. But in each of them, you have what I call here in the middle a gap, a time gap. And it may not always be that clear. You know, the Bible prophets at times use what I call a telescope of prophecy. And they look through the lens of prophecy, and they talk about something right here, close by, or near to be fulfilled, and then something that's going to be fulfilled after that. And it's like, if you've ever looked through binoculars, it makes things seem very close, but really can have a great distance between them. Like in Zechariah, where is this chapter 6, is it? Where it talks about, or is it Zechariah 9, where it talks about, behold, you know, thy king cometh lowly, riding upon the foal of a donkey. And we know that was fulfilled at the triumphal entry of Christ into Jerusalem. Right. And in the next verse, he says that he's going to break the battle bow. Now that's referring to the second coming. At Armageddon, he's going to break the implements of warfare that's going to be put upon him really by the auspices of the Antichrist, whom we are discussing now. And so I think it's interesting that we are given a bridge. And it says some of those people back there are going to have problems, they're going to fall, they're going to fail the Lord, and it's going to be that way for God's people all right up to the time of the end, for it is yet, the end is yet for a time appointed. Then we come to that last verse. I shouldn't say the last verse, the next verse is verse 36. And I believe it is referring to now a future king of the north. Now, do you remember, I said this last week, that the term north and south isn't to be interpreted from our perspective here in the United States, but it's to be interpreted north of Israel or south of Israel. And so it is, the bulk of the bulk of Daniel 11 is concerned with the Ptolemies, which is the king of the south in Egypt, and the Seleucid kings, which are from ancient Syria to the north. And every time that there is a shift in the direction of the prophecy, it will specifically say, well, the king of the north is going to do this, or the king of the south is going to do this. If there is no declaration of a change in the focus of the prophecy, either to the kingdom of the north or to the south, you can rightly assume there's no change in whether it's the king of the north or to the south. It's no vacillating back and forth. There's some of this vacillating back and forth in that chapter. But there are times when they talk about one king and go and talk about another king, and you can rightly assume that it's dealing with the same kingdom that had been in focus prior to that first king. Let me go to verse 20. In verse 20 of Daniel 11, it says, "Then shall stand up in his estate a raiser of taxes." In his estate. Well, that's in the same country as the previous king had been, which was the Seleucid Empire, the king of the north. It doesn't say king of the north here, okay? In verse 21, it says, "In his estate shall stand up a vile person, to whom they shall not give the honor of the kingdom, but he shall come in peaceably." And this is actually the beginning of the prophecy concerning Antiochus Epiphanes. It doesn't mention that he's in the king of the north, that he is a king of the north. But we again can rightly assume that since there has not been a distinction, a declaration made of a shift of the prophetic focus from the king of the north to the king of the south, in the change of kings, that we're still dealing with the same area. So, you may wonder why I'm giving all that much detail. I covered here in this summary, but at the top of page 3, second paragraph, "Likewise, when we cross the bridge to verse 36, we encounter no indication about any change of reference from the north to the south." We've been dealing with the kings of the north leading up to verse 35, the bridge. When we cross the bridge, we're still dealing with the kings of the north. You may ask, well, why is that important? Here's why. The question has been, which of the 4 divisions of the Grecian Empire is the Antichrist to come from? Right off the bat, at the beginning of the 11th chapter, 2 of them are no longer mentioned. It says about, what is it, verse 3 or 4, it says the kingdom of Alexander the Great was divided to the 4 winds. And that's emblematic of the 4 divisions of the kingdom. And then from that point on, from, what is it, verse 5 on to the end of the chapter, we are only concerned with the king of the north, and the king of the south. And you know what's in between, don't you? Thank you. I showed that on the map. I'm not putting all these maps and things up here at this point. But yes, if you have the picture of these empires, I could slow down and dig them out of my briefcase, but I've showed them to you before. And I'm just trying to refresh your memory that you have this jockeying for position between the kings of the north and the kings of the south, with poor, beleaguered little Israel in this kind of political no man's land. First belonging to the king of the north, then to the king of the south, and back and forth. But the reason for this is, why is that important? You may wonder, why did the Lord take all that time to go into these prophecies? He could have made it simpler, I suppose, but this is his approach. I believe he was doing it so he could narrow down geographically for us, limit the geographical area that we can look for the Antichrist. The king of the south is eliminated at this point, because when we get to verse 36, there's no shift